Yesterday I finished 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman or Burkeman, I don't know how it is pronounced. I expected a lot from this book. Maybe I expected a little bit too much, because I already saw something very similar. There is a video by Kurzgesagt on YouTube, which basically also takes a similar perspective on zooming out on life by not taking all the different days or seeing them as years, but just framing them as weeks. And 5,000 weeks, or maybe 5,200 weeks, as in the Kurzgesagt video, is then not much and can actually fit on a sheet of paper like this. So of course, maybe it should be smaller squares. Now, what I expected would be something like, life is short, here is how short life actually really is. Let's talk about this. And also, because it's, at least in the title, it's also a time management promise in there. I would have actually hoped that first he would have established kind of the big theme, and then, okay, how can we make something of the big theme? But in reality, it was a book that was not that long, and it was a book that relied somewhat, in my sense, a little bit too much, but that maybe also just is due to the fact that I just listened and read a lot of these self-help books already. But I figured this might not be a self-help book. What I define as kind of the negative sides of self-help would be that you just claim something that might have worked for you, and then you generalize it. So instead of saying, I did something like this, which is basically the only domain you can really talk about if you haven't studied a subject, or of course there is a range, I would say. The one thing is that you're an absolute expert in something, and the one thing is that you don't have anything at all in terms of knowledge about a certain subject. And now, given your own life, of course, you are the expert. You are the expert about your own life. So one thing one could do is, whenever would generalize statements, instead of saying, this is what you have to do, because that addresses directly another person, is, this is what I had to do, because that often might be the thing that it actually stems from. If I think this is how, if I would say, for example, this is how I increased my pull-up weight in the gym today, then this would be something that I can share. But if I say this is how you can do this, then the problem is that if these two things are different entities, then the knowledge or also the implementation might not be practically applicable. Because as in also drugs, for example, just because something works for one person doesn't mean it works for somebody else also. There is also the thing called placebo effect, which means that if one person just believes something, believes that it helps him, a drug for example, or doing a super weird ritual, then it actually might help him, but not because the thing actually helped him, but because the thinking about basically the positive expectation helped him. So you could also just leave out the thing and just get the positive expectation. But of course the positive expectation can often not be established without the thing, because the thing is kind of what causes the positive expectation. And this is where we kind of get in a weird loop where drugs, for example, could work for some people with placebo effect, but these people would not be able to generate the placebo effect without the drug, or the placebo, if it is just a placebo. And now back to the book. In the book, he often states, this is what you have to do. Not directly, this is what you have to do, but he often generalizes. And I think the author might not have the authority, or at least not in my sense. Of course, there are different concepts of authority, but in, at least from what I know, or let's frame it this way. It seems to me that often offering generalized statements about something in the sense that you don't talk about yourself, but talking about yourself is also kind of ostracized to a certain extent. But then generalizing, on the other hand, means that you would generalize. And if I say, this is how you can increase your pull-up weight, this is how you can live the 4,000 weeks, this is how you can live more in the moment, then this is also a problem, because it might not transfer to you exactly. And because the actual thing that causes my thinking of this is how you could also do it, this is just a projection of what I have experienced onto other people. And might actually speak more about my own thinking than about what is generally true. So the assumptions I make would not be transferable to somebody else. Now, out of all the big concept things I expected, like this is 4,000 weeks, it's actually not that long, and so on and so forth, there actually was not that much in the book, at least not as much as I expected. On the other side, I have asked myself already, I actually wrote a Twitter thread already yesterday about this specific subject, and asked myself, who am I to actually even criticize this author? This author has invested a lot of his time and things, at least, or it was probably his best attempt at this book. And who am I now to criticize this? Can I write something like this? Did I write something like this already? No, I didn't. So therefore, the question is, if I cannot replicate this whole thing, who am I to talk about this even? If this would be a friend of mine, would I talk about this? And this also opens up the question of, who actually can criticize others? Who takes the right to criticize others? And should I take now the right here to criticize this book, or write a review, or criticize this book in a video? I cannot answer. It seems to me that I'm not, and that I maybe should delete the video, but at the same time I actually do want to talk about the books that I read. Maybe it's too selfish, but on the other hand, it also might help people who might read the book, who might want to read the book, guiding them in their decision of what books to pick. If nobody talks about books that are written, then nobody knows what books are actually maybe worth reading. And this is now where we meet the second part, the time management part. I think this was mostly missing. And because these two things were mostly missing, what I ended up with was a classic self-help book, similar to Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now. So, in short, The Power of Now is live in the now, because the future is just a concept. The future is just made up, similar to the past. Both are actually not existent. They only exist as a concept, as a memory, or as a projection in our head. We always live in the infinitely small moment, even though we, of course, also kind of perceive a moment maybe as 1 second, maybe as 10 seconds. But in reality, time can be perceived infinitely small, is infinitely small. The moment is infinitely small. So, if you are a butterfly, for example, I think I heard this about butterflies, that they have a bigger time resolution, a higher time resolution, which means the same moment of time, if we say it's 1 second, for example, is much more to them. And if you take a fly, for example, that only lives for a day, then of course the day is the life for the fly, and everything else would scale down equivalently. If there existed a higher being, or if we just take this perspective of someone who saw universes pop up and then go down again, or expand infinitely, and this would be the moment for somebody else, maybe a god, or just somebody else who had this time frame, this very big time resolution, or this actually very low time resolution, then it all would seem a little bit differently. So the power of now is the fact that you can only have now. There is no future, there is no past. You can only live now. But the problem, I think, with this approach is that it leaves out so much of what makes us human. Mostly it leaves out so much of what makes us think, what makes us go forward, what makes us do things for the future. Because if you concentrate the negative aspect, obviously, on concentrating too much on the now, is that if the now is the only thing that exists, this would be now a straw man, I think, is the right word. Basically taking the argument of the opponent and then making it dumber to make it seem like the argument is actually not that good. So the straw man would be that if you only live in the now, then you might as well, I don't know, do nothing for the future. You might as well not educate yourself. You might as well not try to self-improve, which is the basic formula of self-improvement, because you might as well just live in the now. And because you cannot see the future, and the future is only living in our head, and actually only the present is moving forward with us, then you might not invest in the future. You might just don't do anything, not prepare anything for the future. Now, on the other side, the strawman of the other side of just living for the future might be that you cannot never live in the now. You can never enjoy the things you are currently doing, because you always try to get the next big thing, which is always in the future. So you never can actually enjoy something. Now, these are two very extremes. And that's the whole idea about it. That's already, I think, the resolution. These are two extremes. And we don't have to pick one or the other. It is both. Life is both. One is not just this or that. One doesn't have to live in the now, but never can remember the past. One doesn't have to just live in the now, but never can think about the future. It's just different tools we can use. This one tool is this one perspective of living in the now. This other tool is, okay, if I live in the now also tomorrow, now super thinking, that's maybe what makes us human, the ability to predict the future, or what makes us special or different from animals, or from many kinds of animals or species, the ability to predict the future. So if I now can do something that will make the now tomorrow better, then I might enjoy tomorrow better, but I also, additionally, to then enjoy tomorrow better, might basically add an additional layer of joy, because I can actually look forward to the thing. And this, I think, as I listen to Andrew Huberman more and more, is not so much rooted in maybe human nature, despite the fact that human nature actually describes it quite well. It's not so much that we have to change our thinking from this is now, this is the future, this is the past, and you don't have, you shouldn't anticipate the future, because it obviously is never there. But obviously, as long as you live, it will be tomorrow. So of course you could die today, but in case you don't, maybe you should prepare your meals for tomorrow. Maybe you should do your groceries. So the whole argument, of course, turns ridiculous if you take these two extremes. And if you then have a whole book, maybe 4,000 weeks or large parts of it, which argue for this position of living in the now, or Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now. Of course, for people who are too much thinking for the future all the time, or might be stuck in the past, then concentrating on the power of now might be a good tool, a good perspective. Similar to how minimalism works if people have too much stuff. So if this is a graph, and this is the ideal point of, so this is time, t, and this is the amount of stuff you have. And this is the optimal amount of stuff you have. So now in the beginning, if you have too much stuff, so the number of items, then minimalism is basically the tool that helps you to get rid of the stuff. If you then continuously reduce the stuff over time, and you end up with 0 and only have a shirt and a pant, but cannot even do anything because you don't have a phone, because you don't have money, because you don't have a place to sleep, then you are out of options. So the ideal point is the ideal point. The optimal point is the optimal point. That's what defines optimal. So minimalism only works if you have too much stuff to begin with, and it ceases to be a useful method as soon as you reach the optimal point. Of course, the optimal point might change, but the main idea maybe is not that minimalism as a method should bring you to this optimal point. Of course, that's also the idea, but maybe it's just optimizing your stuff in general. So I wouldn't call it minimalism, because minimalism is basically the reduction function. I would call it functionalism, because that's the number of items that brings you the most joy, that is actually functional. I don't have 5 phones, but I have 2. Why do I have 2? Because I use one as a camera, and the second one is my normal phone, so I can actually show also things on here. So the optimal point is maybe 2 for me, but it might be 1 for somebody else. It might be 16 for somebody else who has a firm that actually requires some verification via phone, for example, and has a lot of SIM cards in it. Frustration is the thing that appeared in my head, or the feeling of frustration that seemed to appear in my head as I continued to listen to this book. Now, I don't want to talk too negatively actually about this book, because I think it's still a nice idea. It's just that it reminded me too much of Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now, which I just had to kind of jog down into me, because I actually just wanted to finish the book. I also wanted to have read the book, so I just finished it, but it was just at some point in time, at least The Power of Now, just speaking about this book, The Power of Now, and not about 4,000 weeks, just turned into nonsense, into repeating and repeating and repeating nonsense. Yeah, just don't live in the future. Here's another example, here's another example, here's another example of just having this one point. I don't know if Eckhart Tolle, for example, I mean, I watched a few interviews of him actually. I mean, what if you write a book like this, and then for the rest of your life you have this one message that everybody is kind of wrong. Not everybody is wrong, but maybe people should concentrate more on the power of now. But concentrating more on the power of now similar or analogous to what we discussed on the other side, on the flip side with minimalism, not on the flip side, but just on the other side of my paper here, is obviously that focusing on the now only is a useful tool for people that are focusing too little on the power of now. Of course, this is now definitions. Too little means it's not optimal. Too much means it's above optimal. So the ideal point again is maybe in the middle, and this is where the present also hits us. So maybe people who think about the past all the time, the power of now might be useful. People who think about the future too much maybe have not actually planning for the future, or maybe don't plan for the future, but are actually kind of anxious about the future and cannot live a day normally. For these people also this function of living more in the now might be useful. But this is now where we again meet back to 4,000 weeks. It just offers also a very similar explanation with very similar examples to the power of now to a large extent. I want to finish with a positive note, and the positive note is it also talks about time, and this is actually an interesting idea that I don't want to say actually too much. I thought about this again and again and again. So I grew up with Christianity, and there was kind of a structure, and the structure of the week is that during the work week you work 5 days, or you go to school 5 days. Then there was the Saturday, which for me meant, because we had kind of my grandparents used to have a farm, so we still had basically a little bit of forest and a little bit of a yard. And so we had to kind of manage the yard. So it was 5 days a week, that was school, and then 1 day where we kind of would manage the yard, and then in the evening we would often watch a movie together or something like this. So it was a little bit of work, and then in the evening kind of a family evening. And then on a Sunday we would go to church. Usually, as a small kid I kind of had to, and as a teenager I maybe didn't that much more. I also was a servant at the church, so this might have helped to increase my church visits over time, my average church visits over time. Now, despite the fact that I now would consider myself an agnosticist, even though the word I actually would use, if not for the definition of the word, would be an atheist, but the statement of atheism is that you say that no, God doesn't exist, but this is obviously not very scientific because you just don't know. So this is agnosticism. You just acknowledge that you don't really know. But at the same time, it seems very unlikely that God exists in the way that the Bible, for example, describes, because there are also a lot of other traditions, not traditions, but religions that also have their own gods. So do all these gods then exist just because we made them up? Now, what I'm trying to say with this is that there was a certain structure to the week, and the structure was work for 5 days. So 5 out of 7 days were work, and then the Saturday was also kind of work, but not the same kind of work, so it was kind of a different kind of work. So we have 1 out of 7 was a different kind of work, and then Sunday was not to be worked. You could read on Sunday, you could also study on Sunday, but you couldn't do anything that was physical labor. And if I did too much of physical labor, there was actually kind of a penalty. Not that a penalty incentive, you could say. You can also work out, you can run on Sundays. We often did bike rides, for example, or we went to museums. And this is actually a structure that I recently thought about, if I have in the future a family, that I also might make again. So during the week, everybody does their own stuff. Then on Saturday, we might do something together, or everybody could kind of on their own do physical labor, even though one might not live on a yard. But just the fact that it kind of brings you down to a normal level, it kind of brings you down to what is actually happening, without being too much on the intellectual side, just being in school, for example, but having to do things with your hands. And then on Sunday is the free day, the family day, and so on and so forth. Now back to 4,000 weeks. This structure he also talks about, the author talks about in his book, is kind of also what was described and prescribed in the past by different kind of religions. We have in Judaism the Sabbath, we have in Christianity the Sunday, or the Sunday just as a kind of adopted thing. Obviously, both religions are very similar with slight differences in who will come back and when he might come back. And actually, very similarly, I also for my own life had to come up with structures, with the structure of me doing certain things at certain parts. And as I, over the years, began to study, as I did different things, I realized that synchronizing my schedule, and this is now an idea directly basically from the book, with other people has a kind of a big benefit. The benefit is that other people also can do things at the same time. Now, you might argue that sometimes it's necessary that you do things on your own. And you could make an argument, for example, for standing up in the morning because less people are awake. Therefore, you reduce distractions because if you write an email to somebody, then the person is unlikely to respond. So therefore, there is not that much of an incentive compared to you at 9 a.m. then writing emails, then people might respond. So by you synchronizing your schedule with others on a daily basis, so standing up, maybe working out, then going about your day, then having lunch, and if other people at the same time have lunch, then you can have lunch together. So this increases the value of time if we also, so if time is a function of different variables, then one of these variables might be how synchronized your schedule or your time with other people is. So the point of the book, and also the point I'm trying to make here, is that time has a certain value and or utility, and this utility is also at least partially dependent on how available others are. If you want to have a family Sunday, but some members of the family are working on Sunday or working shifts on Sunday, then the family Sunday might not be something that works. But if now everybody has free on Sunday, then it would work. So in Germany, for example, or potentially also in other countries with a Christianic background, whether this is evangelical or Catholic, both have kind of the Sunday as the free day. So if now a whole nation cannot really properly work on Sunday, then the whole nation kind of does the same thing. So now if you go on a hike, there might be more people, which might again be a network effect, or the negative side of this network effect. But on the positive side, you can then meet people on a Sunday. You don't have to feel that bad on a Sunday because you're not missing out that much. If you try to compete against a friend of yours in terms of careers, for example, then he might also not do something on Sunday. I mean, he might do, but he cannot go to a shop, for example, that is closed on Sunday in Germany. So there is kind of also, there are a lot of different aspects to this. And this is also a concept he talks about in the book, the synchronity or the synchronization of time in schedules. In total, it was a book. It was not necessarily, I think, for me, I would have maybe preferred to read something else, but this also just might be because I've read at this point like hundreds of books or listened to hundreds of books on self-help and self-management. So if this is the introductory book you read to this concept of managing time, then this might be a little bit better. What I read a few years ago, a decade ago maybe, or maybe longer, is 2 short books on managing time. And these 2 short books would change my life in many ways. The first one, so basically they were both very similar. They both just said, okay, if this is your time, then there are a few days. And this is what we usually refer to as the structure in which we live in the day, because we have to sleep. And also the sun rises. So we go from day to day to day, or it's actually more the other way around. And within the structure, if you want to do anything, then this is what it looks like. There are different time slots within this. So if you want to do anything, basically, just take a look at how you spend your time, because how you spend your time will influence what you will be able to do in the future. If you learn for 2 hours a day, then you might begin to accumulate knowledge. If you work out for an hour a day, then you might begin to accumulate the effects of working out. So you might become healthier, fitter, for example. So both of these books basically told me to just track my time in some way or another. Back then, smartphones didn't really exist when I first read these books. But now I actually am still tracking my time with an app. Of course, there is also the planning of the time of the big events. And there are also now similar concepts like time scheduling and time blocking. But these 2 books mostly began to nudge me into thinking about time, about how I should spend my time. And 4,000 weeks, I hoped at least, would have nudged me into the frame of, okay, I don't have that much time, but would have provided me with more of a wow effect to how life how short actually life is. Of course, I already know, but there was this video by Kurzgesagt which did the job a little bit better in my view. And actually it made me cry when I first watched it, despite the fact I hadn't cried before. Maybe sometimes out of frustration every few months, but other than that, not.